Today you're going to listen to the Tall Tale of John Henry. Remember, tall tales are stories that are told over and over again orally or shared by word of mouth. That means that these tales weren't written down for a long time and that everyone who told the story told it a little bit differently. Tall tales probably became more exaggerated each time the story was told. This particular tall tale is interesting because for more than 100 years we didn't know if the character John Henry was a real person. For many years people believed John Henry was a fictional hero and was a symbol for those who worked on laying the railroad tracks. But today some historians or people who study history now believe that there really was a man named John Henry who really did lay railroad tracks, and that the main event in this story actually happened. As people continued to move westward, new transportation systems were being invented. The older transportation systems became faster and less expensive. One form of transportation made traveling much easier was the railroad and trains. Take a look at this image. This is an image of the railroad tracks about 100 years ago. Railroad tracks were used to expand westward. The tracks were laid by thousands of workers, and tunnels were even dug right through mountains, mostly by hand. Soon, machines were invented that could help the people in what they were doing. The machines could do the work easier and faster. The main action in this story of John Henry centers around John Henry's competition with the machine. Take a moment and predict who do you think will win the competition, John Henry or the machine? In the 1860s, the United States was growing quickly. Immigrants were pouring in, and the railroad companies were laying train tracks that would carry settlers west. One of the railroad companies was called the Chicopee and Ohio, or the C&O for short. The C&O Railroad was named for the two bodies of waters it was intended to connect: the Chesapeake Bay along the east coast and the Ohio River on the west. The engineers who planned the C&O Railroad had to overcome many challenges in order to get trains from the Chesapeake Bay to the Ohio River. But no challenge was ever greater than this. They had to run their tracks through the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachians were like a great big wall that separated the east from the west. Sometimes when the mountains were rolling, more like hills, the C&O workers were able to lay tracks over the top of them. Other times they were able to lay track like a zigzag around the mountains like a snake. But some mountains were too tall to go over and too big to go around. In those cases, the only solution was to dig a tunnel right through the mountains. Digging tunnels was dangerous work. The tunnels were dark and poorly ventilated. That means that there was barely enough fresh air inside of the tunnels for workers to breathe. Many workers were killed in sudden cave-ins. To dig tunnels as fast as they could, railroad workers worked as teams of two. One man would crouch down and hold a steel spike. Then the other man would hit the spike with a big hammer. The first man would twist the spike as much as he could. Then his partner would hit the spike with the hammer again. The two men would work together, banging and twisting, until they had given the spike a deep into the rock. Then they would pull out the spike and move to another spot, and start digging a new hole. After a while, the rock would be full of holes, like a piece of Swiss cheese. Next, the dynamite men would take over. The dynamite men would pack dynamite into the holes and detonate the explosives. Kaboom! The explosion would break up the solid rock into rubble. Then the workers could haul away the rubble, and then they would start digging again. To make a long, hard day's work go by faster, the railroad workers used to have contests. They would pick two teams and see which team could drive its spike further into the mountain in a set amount of time. The winners of these contests became heroes. People would tell stories about these steel-driving men and their amazing feats. Another thing the railway workers did to pass the time while they worked was to sing songs. Sometimes they would even sing songs about other steel-driving men. One of these steel-driving men was named JohnHenry. No one knew for certain where JohnHenry was from. Some say he was from Georgia. Some said he was from Tennessee. Others say he was a Virginia man. As it turns out, it seems likely that he was a former slave. He seems to have started working on the railroad sometime after the end of the Civil War. For years, people thought JohnHenry worked the Big Bend Tunnel on the C&O line, in which is now West Virginia. But now we think he is more likely worked on the Lewis Tunnel in Virginia. One thing is for sure, that JohnHenry was a legend among railway workers. They sang a song that tells a story about how he was born with a hammer in his hand. JohnHenry became known as the most courageous man who ever worked on the railroad. Even as a young boy, he could do the work of a man. They said he had never been defeated in a steel-driving competition. They say he hit a spike so hard that its sparks flew into the air. They say JohnHenry could swing a 10-pound hammer from sunup to sundown and not even get tired. At first, almost all the work on the tunnel was done by hand by workers like JohnHenry. Eventually, however, this began to change. People invented machines that could do some of the work. One of the machines they invented was a steam drill. This was a drill that was powered by a steam engine. The first steam drills were pretty good, but they were not great. Steam drills could drive a spike into a mountain for sure, but not as well as two strong, experienced railway workers like JohnHenry and his partner. Over time, the machines got bigger and better, and they eventually began to replace the men who worked on the railway tunnels. One day, the captain of JohnHenry's work team brought a steam drill to the work site. He bet the steam drill could drive a steel better and faster than JohnHenry could. JohnHenry agreed to compete against the steam drill, and he swore he would do his best to beat it. JohnHenry said to the captain, "Well, a man ain't nothing but a man. But before I let a steam drill beat me down, I'll die with a hammer in my hand. Oh, I'll die with a hammer in my hand." One of the bosses blew the whistle. JohnHenry went to work driving steel the old-fashioned way, with a hammer and a spike. The captain started up the steam drill. It rattled away beside JohnHenry, bleaching steam and banging away at the mountain. The man and the machine worked side by side for several hours. Then the boss blew the whistle again. The bosses took measurements, and then they announced the results. JohnHenry had driven his spike a total of 15 feet into the mountain. And the steam drill? It had only drilled 9 feet. JohnHenry had won. He had beaten that steam drill. Now a man that invented the steam drill, he thought he was a mighty fine. But JohnHenry drove his 15 feet, and the steam drill only made 9. Oh, the steam drill only made 9. The other railway workers roared. They were excited that John Henry had won. He had shown that a hard worker was better than a machine. But John Henry himself was in no condition to celebrate. He had worked so hard that he had suffered a heart attack. John Henry hammered in the mountains, and his hammer was a striking the fire. Well, he hammered so hard that it broke his poor heart, and he laid down his hammer and he died. Oh, he laid down his hammer and he died. The railway men carried John Henry out of the tunnel. They laid him to rest with the other workers who had died. But the legend of John Henry lived on. The C&O Railroad was completed a couple years later, and for years to come, whenever locomotives went down the C&O line past the tunnel they thought John Henry helped dig, those who knew the story would say, "There lies John Henry, king of the steel-driving men." They took John Henry down that tunnel. They buried him in the sand. And every locomotive comin' runnin' roaring by says, "Yonder lies that steel-driving man. Whoa, whoa, yonder lies that steel-driving man."